This is a syllabus journal entry special episode here, and we present elite journalism, women-led American intelligentsia. Hope you enjoy this.
Walking on the sky keeps falling down. Starting to notice the sun. Everything around me hits and frown.
And today we have to represent this American Thought Leaders episode with the Miranda Devine from the New York Post, the world-renowned heavyweight superstar of investigative journalism, and the investigative journalist elite American Thought Leaders. And so without further ado, we just have to represent this explosive episode just for the record, just to have it in our stockpile, to make the wider point and for the vindication and the furtherance of the truth among many, many lies.
Miranda Devine, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thanks for having me, Jan.
It's a very interesting time for you, I'm sure. It's certainly for me. Elon Musk has said he's going to release Twitter censorship files. We'll find out what's in there sometime soon, maybe even today as we're recording. At the same time, Yoel Roth, for example, is on record having said that censoring the Hunter Biden laptop story, which of course you've written about extensively back in October of 2020, was a mistake. And he's even said that the FBI visited Twitter much, I suppose, as they visited Facebook, like Mark Zuckerberg has said. What's your reaction to all this?
Well, I guess the chickens are coming home to roost. Finally, people are starting to understand that the censorship operation around the New York Post's revelations to do with Joe Biden and Hunter Biden's laptop was so egregious that it really amounted to interference in the 2020 election. And I think there are a lot of secrets that a lot of powerful people don't want told about exactly how our story was suppressed, how Joe Biden was protected from that information before the election. And so it's very high stakes for Elon Musk to say that he's going to reveal all the details of the deliberation around that censorship operation. And in fact, he's gone further and said he's going to reveal the whole massive censorship operation that Twitter was running against all sorts of dissenting voices, whether it be on, the botched Afghanistan withdrawal or around COVID-19 vaccines or lockdowns. There was a lot of information that that big tech, the social media giants, were suppressing on behalf of the federal government. And we know in particular with this story, with the Hunter Biden laptop story, that the FBI was involved. We know that from FBI whistleblowers who have said that there was suppression of detrimental information to Joe Biden within the agency. We know that the FBI had the laptop from 2019, and we also know that one of Hunter Biden's former business partners, a guy named Tony Bobulinski, went to the FBI before the 2020 election, handed over 3 of his devices and gave them a long, 5-hour interview about what he knew about Joe Biden's involvement in his son Hunter's overseas business deals. None of that saw the light of day. Tony Bobulinski was never called to testify at the grand jury in Delaware that was looking into Hunter's business dealings, and the FBI never followed up with him. So FBI whistleblowers have told us that was deliberate, that was a deliberate strategy to bury that information. And we also know this is quite a sinister development that we've only discovered in the last few months. The FBI went to Twitter, went to Facebook, and warned them about what they said would be a dump of Russian misinformation or disinformation before the 2020 election. Now, our story came 3 weeks before that election, and obviously, whatever the FBI had warned Twitter and Facebook about was so similar to our story that they censored it within hours of publication. And Twitter, in fact, locked the New York Post account for 2 weeks up until just before the election. And then another sinister twist, which we've only just found out, is that the FBI had been spying on Rudy Giuliani, President Trump's then personal attorney, for 2 years, since a month after he took that job as Trump's attorney. And so they had this covert surveillance warrant on Rudy Giuliani's cloud during the period when John Paul MacIsaac, who was the laptop repair shop guy from Delaware, who had a copy of this, had the laptop, the FBI would have seen the email that he sent to Rudy Giuliani saying, look, I'm worried about this. I've tried to get the FBI to look at it. This is what's in it. It's very frightening. It's dangerous for our national security. Can you tell President Trump? So they would have seen all of that. And then they also would have been able to see my text messages with Rudy Giuliani, so they would have known or had access to that information telling them when the New York Post was going to publish, and that we were.
Absolutely fascinating and completely disturbing. You know, what I'm thinking right now is, let's go back a little bit in time. Let's go back to those days in mid-October, early October 2020.
Yeah.
What was it like when that story hit and you realized that something wasn't going to go as planned? Tell me about that.
Well, we knew this was a big story, and it was a big, courageous move by the New York Post editors to publish it, because it was so close to the election. It was going to have an impact. It was detrimental to one of the two candidates for president. So very high stakes. We expected that there would be pushback because of that. What we didn't expect was that big tech would weigh in, would, unsheathe their claws, show the world their power, and step in and censor the oldest newspaper in the country, the fourth largest by circulation, and not only do that, but be supported by the rest of the media. And then, of course, shortly after the censorship happened, 4 days after our story was published, there was a letter, an open letter published by 51 former intelligence officials, high-ranking people, 4 or 5 directors of the CIA or acting directors of the CIA, people like Leon Panetta, Michael Hayden, John Brennan, James Clapper. These were people who had very high-ranking jobs, and they were putting the authority of their former office to a letter that lied about our story and said that Hunter Biden's laptop, that our story had all the earmarks of what they said was a Russian information operation, and that was weasel words. What the world heard was that this was a Russian disinformation operation, and of course that just justified big tech censorship and justified the rest of the media not touching the story. And so Joe Biden used that letter, that lie about Russian disinformation, in his last debate against Donald Trump, and he said, this is garbage, this is just a Russian plant, and it worked for him. It got Joe Biden off the hook.
When did you first realize something, that this censorship was happening, and how, what was happening in the newsroom?
Oh, well, I mean, within hours of the story going live, we kept the story until 6 a.m. And I think by 11 a.m., Facebook announced on Twitter, actually, that they were basically throttling the story, pending fact-checking. And by the way, that fact-checking never happened as far as we can ascertain, because the most obvious way you would do it is you would contact the other recipients of the emails that we were publishing, and ask them, did you get this email? And I know, having talked to recipients, that none of them got any question or phone call from Facebook. So that basic fact-checking was never done. We're talking about, almost 2 years later, or more than 2 years later. And then Twitter followed suit immediately. I guess it was more chagrin and shock that this was happening and that people were accepting it, that There was just silence in the face of really egregious censorship. I guess that was but also we were busy publishing more stories that were coming out of the laptop. It was a very, frenetic time in politics right before the election.
I think the New York Post Twitter account was basically halted, right, so to speak, from publishing.
Locked for 2 weeks.
So what was the impact of that?
Well, financially, it's a big impact. Both Facebook and Twitter, we were not able to do, now those platforms are very big dissemination avenues for newspapers and media outlets. Kayleigh McEnany, for instance, who was then President Trump's press secretary, she tried to share our story on Twitter and she was locked out of her account, suspended for that. So they were really serious about stopping that story being published, and of course then we couldn't disseminate any of our other stories. It was a financial penalty, as well as I guess a slap in the face and a frightening overreach. And remember that just shortly after that, these social media platforms also deplatformed a sitting president of the United States, and that had reverberations around the world. Even Emmanuel Macron, who frowned on a lot of aspects of President Trump, he was horrified. He spoke out about that because these leaders know that if these unaccountable oligopolies, Facebook, Twitter, Google, if they have the power to ban, censor, deplatform a sitting president, that's way too much power.
By the way, I read Laptop from Hell. I've never sat down and kind of read the whole thing through. I just did it recently, and my goodness, the amount of information you have in that book, it's difficult to ingest, frankly, the volume. One of the things that's happened recently is Jiang Zemin, the former Chinese dictator, has passed away. And, I see all these headlines, like in the New York Times, who oversaw the meteoric growth of the Chinese economy. I don't know if that's the exact headline, but something along these lines. My sense of this situation is he oversaw the compromising by the Chinese Communist Party of the global financial system, which means the U.S. financial system. And when I was reading, the Bohai Harvest affair at CEFC, this is kind of one of the key tools of the Chinese Communist Party to infiltrate the global system. It sort of creates a picture of how this is actually done, how they do things. I thought that's what I thought was most interesting, looking at it from that perspective.
Yeah, I think the Biden family is a sort of a model for how China plays the long game to infiltrate into the highest reaches of American power elites. And Joe Biden was targeted very early on by Zemin, actually, when he was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he went on a trip to China organised by Zemin at that time, and he was met with the Chinese Communist Party top dogs, and they took him to an island. I can't pronounce the name, but it's the equivalent of Martha's Vineyard in China. And there they plied him with information about how wonderful China was and how China was a rising democracy and was, embracing freedom and just wanted to become wealthy, and that China was no threat. And of course, Joe Biden swallowed all of that, and it's I think a great tragedy for America that a man like Joe Biden, who is I would say a hollow man without any real values, easily bought, and not too bright, should have been targeted so early by the Chinese Communist Party and have been such a useful tool to them in his entire career, and now he is president, of course. And when in 1979, when Joe Biden came back to America, he was waxing lyrical about China and what a wonderful place it was and how it was going to be our friend. And, one of his most famous lines was, nothing to fear here, they're not going to eat our lunch, that's a joke. He was so gushing in his praise for China that he was mocked actually by the Weekly Standard at the time for his, extreme gullibility. And that sort of love affair with China continued for Joe Biden. In 2001, he was, an influential senator. I think he was still chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, and he was instrumental in allowing China into the World Trade Organization. Most of the negativity was coming from his own party, from the Democrats. This was during Clinton's presidency. He managed to overcome that resistance, and so, of course, that marked the sort of end of the sort of manufacturing, middle class of middle America. And I think that, Joe Biden ever since then has had this sort of delusion that he somehow has some special insight into China. He was duchessed early on by now President Xi, when President Xi was vice president, when Barack Obama was president of the US, and Joe Biden was his vice president. And so Biden and Xi met several times. You hear Joe Biden often boasting about the number of hours that he spent with President Xi, who is a chemical engineer, who is, whatever else you say about him, he's an intelligent man. And for him to spend hours and hours talking to Joe Biden, and Joe Biden, we know how he speaks. He talks malarkey, he tells tall tales, he big notes himself. President Xi has obviously made a study of Joe Biden to spend so much time with him over the years. And for one reason, and that is to explore the weaknesses in America, to satisfy himself of his own superiority, intellectual superiority and moral superiority to America. And I think, therefore, Joe Biden has not been a good representative for America to earn any respect, from China, certainly from President Xi.
Something you mentioned back in 2001, you said most of the opposition came from the Democratic Party. I think that's correct. I guess what I was thinking as you're describing all this is very much a bipartisan love affair.
Yes.
With the Chinese Communist Party. And I think the Chinese Communist Party was an equal opportunity influence peddler.
And still is.
And still is.
Mm-hmm.
And still is. But what you describe in Laptop from Hell, which is, curiously captured, in some more intricate detail because of the existence of the laptop, is, I think, not the exception. It's kind of more the rule that this kind of activity happens. What do you think? That's what I think.
Absolutely. I mean, I think influence peddling is a Washington disease, and it's bipartisan. I do think Joe Biden is a master at it. And look, I guess because of the laptop and because of the sort of Hunter Biden's former business partners who I've had the opportunity to talk to, and also because of the work of the Republican senators Chuck Grassley and Ron Johnson, and they're sort of tracing the money trail from China, Russia, Ukraine, other countries into the bank accounts in America of the Biden family and their various associates. I have a very good picture of exactly how Joe Biden was targeted and influenced by and used by the Chinese Communist Party through his family.
The cover-up of this whole situation has become the big scandal. And so, even as much as as what exists on the laptop and what we know from there. What do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the laptop may end up being bigger than the corruption story itself because it involves the FBI and because of what we have learned about how, the laptop itself was buried by the FBI, how the FBI then apparently and we only have circumstantial evidence really, but it's certainly, and we'll know more when Elon Musk reveals all, but it certainly seems as if the FBI colluded with big tech to suppress the laptop before the election. And then you have the 51 former intelligence officials, these top CIA directors, acting directors and so on, who are also whether or not they colluded with the Biden campaign and Democratic operatives, I don't know, but they certainly interjected themselves into the election campaign to dishonestly traduce the New York Post's reporting and say the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation. So that was a concerted effort by the security apparatus to crush this story that was damaging to one of the two candidates for president. And, I think it's really important to remember with this story that people talk about the Hunter Biden laptop, but it's not about Hunter Biden, who is this, 52-year-old, I think former drug addict, crack addict, who had a terrible period, during most of the laptop's coverage of being, a raging crackhead, addicted to prostitutes, living this dissolute life, spending vast sums of money and ricocheting around the world and hanging out with the sort of worst oligarchs and the sort of inner sanctum of the Chinese Communist Party, the inner sanctum of Vladimir Putin's court. And so just the most bizarre and sort of interesting story, and a tale of great tragedy because he had his own personal demons. But it's not about Hunter Biden, it's about Joe Biden. So Joe Biden had this, he talks always about being the poorest man in Congress. But actually, he lived a very lavish lifestyle. He lives in, a beautiful mansion, always bought and sold houses well above his, purported salary, dresses well. His entire family, benefited from grace and favour jobs and government sinecures and scholarships and judge clerkships and so on. And Hunter Biden's role in that was to be the bag man, to be the guy who would, in his own words, give half his salary to his father, who would, in his own words, again from the laptop, had to support the entire family. And he became quite resentful of that. So I think, the cover-up is a big story, but also you can't lose sight of the fact that this is a story about Joe Biden. And that is why the cover-up was so concerted, and people who probably would have preferred to remain in the shadows and not have the world know how powerful they were, they decided that the stakes were so high at the 2020 election that they revealed themselves.
And the other part that's very interesting that is kind of exposed by this, because of course CFC kind of collapses where Chairman Ye, who heads it, gets kind of rolled up in one of Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign, because Ye was a Jiang Zemin loyalist. And this is, so basically Hunter Biden gets caught up in the internal political struggles of the Chinese Communist Party, probably not realizing that this sort of thing is going on. And so anyway, I thought it was fascinating to see that manifest as that whole thing is being rolled up. You have this sort of play-by-play that in the book. It's really interesting to see how that plays out.
Yes, well, CFC, as you say, was the capitalist arm of President Xi's Belt and Road Initiative, and during the last 2 years of Joe Biden's vice presidency, the Biden family and their various American associates were working for CFC all around the world, in the Middle East, in Europe, places like Romania, to help China buy infrastructure, buy energy assets. And a lot of these countries by then were a bit loath to allow themselves to be taken over by China effectively. And so what the Biden family name gave them was invaluable. It reassured these countries that that they wouldn't be just swallowed up in debt traps as China have been doing around the world, that this was the vice president of the United States was in partnership with this company, so it had to be good, and that opened a lot of doors. And
well, this is what the family implied, because Biden himself was not out there making these guarantees, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, so that's the interesting thing. The Republicans in the House are now having investigations into this whole affair, and they've been at pains to point out that they're investigating Joe Biden's involvement in his family's influence peddling scheme. And Joe Biden told the American people during the campaign and ever since that he knew nothing about his son Hunter's overseas business dealings, but there is just copious evidence on the laptop that he met with numerous, at least a dozen of Hunter Biden's overseas business partners, from China, from Kazakhstan, from Russia, from Ukraine. And he met them in Beijing, invited them into his vice presidential residence in Washington, D.C. He had a dinner, at least one dinner at Cafe Milano in Georgetown. Hunter organised one, I think it was in April of 2015, for his father to meet his business partners from Kazakhstan and Russia and Ukraine. And the Biden campaign denied that when we published news of that meeting, at least with the Ukrainian before the election campaign. Since then, the White House has admitted that, yes, Joe Biden did attend that dinner, but, he only was there briefly, they said, and not for any nefarious purpose. You can't be a little bit pregnant. He was there. So Joe Biden did meet with these people, therefore was participating in that demonstration that is important to, influence peddling partners, people who are buying influence, that, yes, the important person is involved, you're able to get him to come to a dinner, you're able to get him on the phone. And, even if Joe Biden doesn't speak specifically about, we've never heard from anybody, including Tony Bobulinski, Hunter's former business partner, that Joe Biden ever addressed specifically any favours that he was going to give to anyone. He always spoke at a, quote, high level. He still was meeting these people. He still was demonstrating his availability. And so I think that's the way the Chinese, and in fact all influence peddling operations operate, but particularly in China, it was very obvious to Chinese eyes what was going on when Joe Biden, as vice president, flew into Beijing on Air Force Two with his son Hunter Biden in tow. This was, American power come to do private business. And Hunter Biden was what Chinese refer to as a princeling. So you're not stupid enough to give the bribe straight to the powerful person. You give it to their family members. That's what happens in China. And so that was how the Chinese saw Hunter Biden's appearance. To American eyes, there were a few questions about it, but Joe Biden just dismissed those questions as saying, well, he's a good family man, he's very close to his family, he likes to bring along family members on his overseas trips. That's a convenient cover story for what really, when you look at the pattern of Hunter Biden's involvement and access to the powerful people overseas that his father was meeting, you see a pattern of corruption that's unmistakable.
What do you think Elon Musk's revelation of the Twitter censorship files, which I keep calling them that in my head, what do you think will come out of that? What do you expect?
Look, what I would like to see and what we can't get out of Facebook, I've asked them and I've asked the FBI, exactly what did the FBI tell you to look out for when they warned of a dump of Russian disinformation before the 2020 election? I have actually asked Facebook a few questions. I said, did they mention Joe Biden? Did they mention Hunter Biden? Did they mention a laptop? The answer I got back was They did not mention Hunter Biden. So that implied to me, well, they mentioned Joe Biden. You didn't say they didn't. They mentioned a laptop. That's the question. I'm hoping Elon Musk will tell us the exact date. How soon before our story was published did the FBI go and warn Twitter? And what exactly did they warn them to look out for? I think the more specific those warnings were, and my suspicion is that they were quite specific because Twitter and Facebook so quickly were able to censor our story, recognise it as the information that they'd been warned about. I'm interested to know if that information was so specific it could only have come from their surveillance of Rudy Giuliani.
Do you think there's any possibility that the FBI was had by someone, that they were, misdirected about this information?
How so?
If they're coming and saying there's going to be this Russian disinformation, someone came to them and he showed them information, so yes, there's going to be this Russian disinformation operation.
I think if there was a misdirection, it would have been internal to the FBI. And I think that because of what FBI whistleblowers have told us, who also have come forward to Senate Republicans and House Republicans and told their stories. And what they've told us is that internally there were a number of there was at least one analyst and one agent now who the agent has left, Timothy Tebow, who were telling other agents not to look at the Bobulinski material and put that information and perhaps other information into a sort of a black box where it couldn't be accessed, and effectively buried it, and told other agents who might have investigated it that it was disinformation. I'm not sure exactly what happened with the laptop, because that was given to the FBI by John Paul McIsaac, the laptop repair shop owner, in December of 2019. And he had a really difficult time with the FBI. At first, they wouldn't accept it. His father was sort of threatened when he went to the FBI, telling them about it and saying that his son wanted to pass this information on and was concerned from a national security standpoint, that he was concerned about the Ukraine material. And his father felt that he was being threatened when he went to an FBI office, that the person he spoke to said, well, effectively, your son shouldn't have this information, whereas his son had the laptop perfectly legally because Hunter Biden had not paid his $85 bill and had signed a receipt saying that if he didn't pick it up in 90 days, it became the property of the laptop shop. So that was sort of a bit off-putting. And then what was really off-putting for John Paul McIsaac is that when finally two FBI agents came to his shop to pick up the laptop and a copy of the hard drive and left behind a receipt for it, they said to him, or subpoena actually, one of them turned and said to him, in our experience, nothing happens to people who basically keep their mouths shut. And he wasn't quite sure whether that was a warning, but he was discomforted by it. And when he initially told me about it, I thought, you're a little bit paranoid. And I understand why. I mean, there's a lot of pressure on whistleblowers, and in my experience, quite often they do get a bit paranoid. So I sort of dismissed his concerns. But now, looking 2 years later, as we've seen more and more information about the cover-up, the internal sort of misdirection from the FBI, the suppression of this, the laptop and the Bobulinski material, and what the whistleblowers have been telling us about really the politicisation of the Washington field office. Now I'm more inclined to believe John Paul McIsaac's instinct, which was that he was being warned to keep his mouth shut.
Are you still in touch with him?
Oh, yes, a lot. In fact, he's just published a terrific book called American Injustice, and it's his story of his involvement. He went from being, a very quietly successful small businessman in a nice part of Delaware who, had a 5-star reviews on Apple for his computer repair shop, to becoming a pariah in that area. As he said, and as he was told, the Bidens control Delaware, and so he could no longer work there. He had to flee to Colorado, shut his shop up. He hasn't had a shop since, and he's been in financial doldrums. So I do hope his book does well.
You're probably in touch with some of these other characters that are in A Laptop from Hell, and so do they believe that this whole situation, especially this cover-up, will be, sort of exposed, that this was a reality? Do they think there will be some sort of justice?
I think there are varying opinions. If you talk to, say, Tony Bobulinski, who really is a hero, along with John Paul MacIsaac, who put himself out there before the election to tell the American people what he knew about Joe Biden's involvement in this scheme. He's a patriot. He's a naval veteran. And he was concerned particularly about China and about what he saw as the potential for the president, Joe Biden, being compromised by China. He was very exercised by that. He had everything to lose. He's a successful businessman with a young family. He didn't want to become public, and he hasn't since then been very public, been as little in the public eye as he can be, but he feels honor bound to make sure that the American people and the congressional investigators have all the information they need to at least expose China's role in trying to sort of influence the top echelons of American politics. And then others of Hunter's former business partners, I think, are adopting a wait-and-see attitude. They understand the power of the Bidens. I mean, he is president of the United States, and they are probably a little afraid of that. To a man, they feel betrayed and let down. Their involvement with Hunter has been nothing but trouble for them. I mean, in one case, Devon Archer was Hunter Biden's best friend in business. He's now facing a jail term and an enormous loss of, everything he's worked for, his houses, his entire family wealth. I think he has a $40 million judgment against him. So that's on appeal at the moment. But he's really, for someone who was told by Hunter Biden that you're an honorary Biden, you're part of the family, we never let you down. He's been let down by the Biden family. I think perhaps, not that I've been told this, but perhaps he felt that he was in line, could be pardoned by Joe Biden, but Hunter Biden refuses to take his calls. He's just been cast adrift. And so I think that's the way a lot of these people feel, that the Bidens will look after their own, but everyone else who was loyal to them and help them make money is thrown to the wolves.
What are you working on these days?
Well, I must say I'm very interested in the goings-on in the FBI, particularly the politicization of the Washington field office. Every day there's a new revelation there. I talk to various whistleblowers, including one I can name because he came public, an agent called Steve Friend, who blew the whistle on really nefarious activities within abuse of authority within the FBI, some very questionable case practices when it came to the pursuit of January 6 people, and he felt that this was really untoward and a violation of people's constitutional rights, and he didn't want to be involved in it, and so he raised concerns with his superiors, and from then on he was punished. Until now he's on suspension without pay, and he's gone public. And And so he also was able to put me in touch with people and tell me a little about the politicisation of the Washington field office, which was involved in the suppression of the Hunter Biden material. So I guess the Hunter Biden story has brought me into a wider story about the sort of internal, what you have to call corruption of the FBI politicisation. So that's something I'm interested in. I'm also interested in, big tech, the power of big tech. Elon Musk is a never-ending source of interest and news.
After all of this, right, we have CBS, for example, 2 years later admitting, well, in fact, yes, we verified it finally. I think that's maybe what the story was. But there were a lot of these headlines that used, for example, that story with the 51 intelligence officials, including 5, leaders of the intelligence agencies, who said it was all the hallmarks or earmarks of Russian disinformation, but the headlines didn't say that. The headlines were a little more direct. And I haven't seen any retractions yet. Have you?
No. I mean, it's just like with the Russia collusion stories that the New York Times and the Washington Post won Pulitzer Prizes for, that turned out to be completely bogus. And they never retract or go back. There might be a bit of stealth editing, but they will never admit that they were wrong. There was some excuse, I think, before the election for media organisations to be a bit wary if they didn't have the laptop, hadn't had the time that we had the advance notice of being able to do the due diligence on the material that we were publishing. But there was no excuse for the New York Times, etc. New York Times was the first out of the box to wait 19 months before they wrote a very minor admission that the laptop was real, that the information was true, and that was buried in the 19th paragraph of a story which really was just about rehearsing Hunter Biden's defences in this case in Delaware, where he's being investigated by the US attorney there for alleged, offences such as money laundering and tax evasion and FARA violations. He, from what we understand, has paid back the IRS $2.8 million in back taxes. That, by the way, was lent to him by an entertainment attorney he's become friendly with called Kevin Morris in Los Angeles. But I just feel that it's too little too late. And in all of these stories, it's more like they're just, covering themselves because they know that at some point Hunter is either going to be indicted or enter into a plea deal with the US attorney in Delaware, and so they will have to explain to their readers why they'd been kept in the dark all this time. So they sort of did a limited hangout, enough information about Hunter Biden's troubles, his legal issues, to say that they've covered the story, but there's always a paragraph buried in each story that's almost identical across the different media organisations, which absolves Joe Biden. It says, Joe Biden, there's no evidence that he had anything to do with this. And that's so ridiculous because there's so much evidence. That's what it's all about. That's what my book was all about. Not about Hunter Biden and his travails. It was about Joe Biden and his influence in the family's influence peddling scheme around the world when he was vice president, abusing his authority, putting America's national security at risk.
We have this kind of tribalism or hyper-partisanship in the U.S. to the point where if you're on the wrong team, even if you're wrong, you're still supported, right? And I know, we've talked about this before, neither of us feel particularly partisan in what we're doing, but, a lot of people might say we are. What do you make of this whole phenomenon, and how do we deal with it as a country?
I think it's a function of a sort of a uni-party that has grown up in cozy Washington. I think corruption is a big part of that. You don't rock the boat, I won't rock the boat. We'll all have our cozy little deals and we won't tell on each other and it'll all be fine. The only losers are the American people. On both sides you have politicians who enter Congress without much money and leave multimillionaires, whether it be through insider trading or influence peddling or whatever other little schemes they have going. So the grift is very strong in Washington, D.C., and I think that leads to policy blurring between the parties. And into that, in 2016, stomped Donald Trump. And he wasn't part of the swamp. And for all his personal flaws, for all his clumsiness and mistakes in office, he really did expose that sort of uni-party corruption, the sort of deep state bureaucracy which operated regardless of which party was in power, which operated to its own, agenda. And that was not necessarily in Americans' best interests. It's a globalist agenda. And so I think Americans who saw their standard of living, their culture being eroded over the years had become disillusioned with the establishment Republican Party, and that was why they went for a barbarian, Donald Trump, who was going to go in there and break it all up. And I think that just reflected a real failing on the part of the Republican Party and should have been a wake-up call to them. I'm not sure if it has been, but that's the polarization. It's not just a polarization between Democrats and Republicans. It's between the sort of globalist elites and regular middle-class or formerly middle-class Americans who feel that their country is being sold out from under them and feel really desperate and angry about it. And the polarization comes from their anger, their mistrust of the institutions, and the elites' condescension and patronising attitude towards them. When Hillary Clinton talked about deplorables, she wasn't just reflecting a Democrat sensibility, she was reflecting the sensibility of the bipartisan, bi-coastal elites.
Best case scenario in coming years, what would you like to see happen to try to shift this reality that you're...
Well, I think two things have to happen. One is that Washington has to clean up as much as possible the corruption. It's an incredibly corrupt town. I'm shocked at the corruption. And I hope that the Republicans are resolute and have integrity and do pursue this investigation of Joe Biden. Because even if it doesn't result in any criminal charges, or I certainly don't expect that would happen, but at least it will expose and let's hope create some safeguards against this kind of influence peddling operation continuing in Washington, and protecting Americans from the malign influence of particularly our greatest adversary, China. And so that's one thing, cleaning up Washington. And secondly, I would hope that, the one benefit, I guess, of the Trump reign was that it really opened people's eyes up to the sort of detrimental influence of the sort of bipartisan, elite, malign, globalist elite in America. And so Trump was he was the titular leader of the populist nationalist movement, but that existed before him and it will continue after him. So I would hope that there would be a Republican leader who will carry that movement forward, but in a much less polarizing way, in a much cleverer way, not allowing himself to be taken down and destroyed in the way that Trump kind of naively did. His administration was really crippled from the beginning by the FBI spying on him and intervening and attacking his various people in his orbit. And I think that I'm not choosing anyone who it could be, but I think that there will be younger Republican leaders that come up in that vein who will learn from the lessons of Trump and be able to lead the country and possibly unite the country. I think Joe Biden's election in part was driven, perhaps mainly was driven by a desire by the great swath of Americans in the middle who just wanted to be unified again, to have peace and calm and tranquility. America is, a very sociable and good-natured country, and Joe Biden promised that. He promised to be a unifying president. Unfortunately, he's been the opposite. He's been a very divisive and malignant force, demonizing Republicans, demonizing the opposition, talking about semi-fascist, ultra-MAGA, locking up his political opponents, sicking the DOJ onto parents at school board meetings or any kind of dissenters, politicizing the FBI and the DOJ, and weaponizing social media against his political adversaries. I think that's been really destructive. And I do believe that Americans have within them the ability to turn back that hatred and polarization and unite around a real stateswoman who can perhaps move forward and unify the country.
What's to prevent, this, let's call it the megaphone, right, from deciding that the next, say, Republican leader is evil and basically creating the same sort of intensifying the polarization that we see today?
Look, you're spot on, because you can see it already with the demonization of Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who is spoken about as the sort of presumptive heir to Trump. He is much smarter, though, than Trump. I think he's learned from Trump. He punches back just as hard, but he also is on top of the detail, and so from that point of view, I think he won't allow the narrative to catch on and catch him out and damage him as much. I think also during the Trump era, a lot of people became disillusioned with the media. I think trust in the media has plummeted to an all-time low. So there's less influence there. And also social media. I hate to put a lot of faith in Elon Musk. He's a mere mortal. He's a billionaire with, lots of his own personal foibles and agendas.
And exposure to China.
Absolutely, with Tesla. Yes, so he's certainly not the Messiah, but at least he's sort of given us an idea of what freedom of speech in social media can do. It allows the truth to be told. It allows real-time fact-checking of lies that unfortunately are propagated and created, these dishonest narratives, by the establishment elite media, and the New York Times, the Washington Post, CBS, NBC. It's disgraceful, and also in collusion with the security apparatus. That's what we saw with the Russia collusion hoax. That was seeded by deep state intelligence officials, and it's frightening that the media just gullibly swallowed that without doing any of their own checking. It was all a lie. The Steele dossier was a lie, and they won Pulitzer Prizes for it. I think the faith in that is plummeting, and I think, if the Republicans can get hold of social media and break up its power and somehow prevent one side of politics from being able to control it, then that could be good. But it sort of depends on the Republican Party getting its act together. And I think that's a very big if at the moment.
Well, Miranda Devine, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Jan.
Thank you all for joining Miranda Devine and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.
So in that case, we just had to add this small piece of elite journalism. It's groundbreaking and shedding light on some of the most pertinent and prescient questions that we have about the nature of truth in America's modern corporate media disinformation complex.